Here we're talking about freedom of the press, and this is one of the more important parts, as all are in the First Amendment. But our founding fathers were very concerned with freedom of religion first, freedom of speech so that you can say and express yourself, and then freedom of the press, to have the free flow of information. Our founding fathers were very concerned with that because you can only make good decisions when you know what's actually going on. If you can't know what's going on, then how do you organize your life in the best possible way? It's probably not going to be very good. And how do you vote properly for your government? It's also not going to be a very informed vote. And so that's really something that's very important to our founding fathers. Okay? Now, there are some ground rules for journalism that the Supreme Court has ruled over the years. You cannot just print anything. Remember, the idea is to have truth in the press so that you can have good information so that you can make good decisions. So, what our Supreme Court has done is they have written rules in there about slander and libel. So, slander is when you say something untrue about someone and it causes damages. And libel is when you print something in the news that is untrue and causes damages. Okay? So slander and libel laws are there to make sure that people do not hurt each other in some kind of damaging way with the words they use. Now, it's hard to prove this most of the time for most citizens. For example, if someone says something untrue about you, okay, that's rude, that's not nice, and usually that's pretty much where it stops. The law says that you actually have to cause damages with those words, okay? The classic example is saying something untrue about someone and getting them fired. That would be slander. And usually, even then, it's very hard to prove unless it's some kind of public figure. Like, are you saying something untrue about someone and then no one will hire them again? That's the kind of thing that would be slanderous, okay? So it has to have two components. It has to be untrue, provably untrue, and it has to cause damages. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter, all right? So slander and libel are things that cannot be done. Now, journalists are held to a higher standard on this because they've been trained and they know the rules on slander and libel. And so they are asked to fact check things before it goes to print or before they speak it on the news. All right? So in that regard, they're held to a higher standard, and most newspapers or news agencies or news organizations will definitely have people that are known as editors that will check stories before they are run to make sure they're not slanderous or libelous, and make sure their business isn't open to lawsuits, because they could get sued pretty heavily if they engage in these practices. And often what happens is that most journalists are hired as independent contractors, and so if they do something wrong, then they're just immediately fired, and so the business survives, but that journalist is out. And there have been some pretty high-profile journalists that have been fired over the years based upon slander, okay? So you can look those up if you want, but that's something that's out there. Now, what if you're just offering your opinion? Does that count as slander? Well, to the common citizen, that's pretty accepted, okay? If you just say, in my opinion, and whatever statements you say, you're really almost never going to have some kind of issue with slander. People might say, oh, you're wrong, oh, that's crazy, but that's their freedom of speech, okay? So if you engage in putting your opinion in the news, most newspapers will have something called the editorial page. So if you look in the newspaper, usually towards the middle, you're going to find the editorial page, and you'll find some rules there, like must be 250 words or less, but people can write a letter to the editor of the paper, and they will often print those, and you can put your opinion out there into the public. So if you want to inform people about something or tell people about something, The editorial page is a great place to do that. So it's a good way to communicate with your local community, and you can say just about anything. Now, if you engage in slanderous information, you could open yourself up to a lawsuit, but that's very rare, all right? Usually, if you say something untrue as a citizen, people are just like, nah, we don't agree. That's freedom of speech. That's how you have a good exchange of ideas, okay? But the journalists are usually held to a higher standard, and news agencies are as well, okay? Which brings us to our next question, open and closed platforms. All right. Most of these laws were written before the internet. So when the internet came along, it was a whole new thing, and we weren't sure how to treat it. What eventually evolved over the last few years was the idea of open and closed platforms. So a closed platform is one where you have to have your facts straight. You are considered the press, and you can censor anyone from using your platform, like NBC, ABC, CBS, a news platform, the American Broadcasting Corporation, the National Broadcasting Corporation. That's ABC and NBC. They can censor who uses their platform. They can allow some things to be said, and they can stop things from being said. They're held to a high standard. They cannot commit slander or libel. So they have that standard, but they also have the power to censor people on their platform. Okay? If you have an open platform, then an open platform is not held to the standard of slander or libel. People are using it as a service. They can say pretty much anything on there. And so the deal was they will not be held accountable for any slander or libel. But they will also not be able to censor people on that platform. It is an open platform. Okay? So what do I mean by examples of open platform would be like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok. Those are things that are open source platforms. So people just put things on there. Now, of course, if you open it up to the public to say anything they want, they'll say just about anything. And there will certainly be untrue things in there. And so the internet open source platform providers argued that they shouldn't be held accountable for slander laws. And that's how the laws were written. You will not be held accountable for slander, but you have to keep it open and not censor it. Just in the last year, this has become a really big issue because several of the open source platforms have started to just censor people. Okay? So they'll be censoring people they don't agree with, censoring other news agencies that might be their competition in the future. Yeah, okay. So those have been some questions that have been raised, and in fact, several of the CEOs of these companies have been called before Congress. I think it was just like a month ago, and were really, questioned about just what are you doing? It was basically like a warning. It was like a talking to from Congress saying, hey, stop it, okay? Because Congress could, in fact, take away their open source platform exemption. See, they're not held accountable for slander laws. So why are they censoring? So that's a question that's still hanging over our society right now. Do we want our open source platforms to have like the best of both worlds, which is certainly what those companies want. They would like to have the ability to censor whoever they want, and the ability not to be sued for anything that they allow. I mean, that would be pretty nice, but, currently the laws aren't written that way. There's this division there. There's closed and there's open source, but they're sort of merging. So we'll see which direction Congress takes this. That'll be interesting, all right? Because remember, Congress writes the laws, and how they write them, it's going to be interesting. We'll see. Comedy. So if you ever watch shows like Saturday Night Live, okay, you're going to see clearly they say things that are slanderous. I mean, they insult public figures all the time. They insult most every politician all the time. So how are they able to do this? The Supreme Court ruled that if something is clearly for comedy, then they can get away with saying just about anything they want. So for comedic, artistic purposes, you're allowed to engage in a comedy routine that is slanderous. Okay? Pretty interesting. So you're going to see on Saturday Night Live all the time politicians are made fun of, public figures are made fun of, you know. This kind of thing is going to be on there, but if you go watch that show, it is clearly for comedic purposes. And that's what the Supreme Court has ruled. Lately again, what qualifies as a comedy show? You know, is The Daily Show, is it comedy? Is it news? So if you take news things and you say comedic things about them, does that mean you're a comedy show? And then can you also insert your opinions, and you can be slanderous with them, but then turn around and say, oh, it's just comedy, right? We're all just joking around here, right? So there's a fine line that's, I think, being crossed. You know, I've seen a lot of routines that they're pretty funny, and then they'll throw some, you know, opinion comment in there, and no one laughs. So is it news? Is it comedy? Is it opinion? Can you be sued for it? We're going to wait and see how this shakes out, because the boundaries that used to be pretty well defined have sort of blurred in all of these areas. And so freedom of the press is really in fluctuation right now as to where that's actually going to land. I see a lot of changes that are going to happen. Maybe some things are going to be allowed, maybe some things are going to be clamped down on, but this is one that's going to see a lot of things being addressed in the near future. Okay? All right. Sort of taking off to the side here, we're going to take a look at whistleblowers, because this applies to what we've been talking about, and then it'll come back. All right? So a whistleblower is someone who informs the public about something that an organization is doing incorrectly. Usually it's like a government organization, all right? So if your government does something illegal, unethical, and someone comes forward and says, hey, this is what happened, we do have protections under the law that say whistleblowers will not be prosecuted because they reveal something the government is doing wrong. The citizens of the United States want to know what their government is doing, traditionally, and they want people to step forward when things are wrong and say, something happened that was illegal, and I want to tell you about it. So we have protections in place for that. The curious case of Edward Snowden. Back in, I think, early 2000s, you know, Edward Snowden came out and said, I think it was around 2004 and 5, but I'll check on that. He said, look, the National Security Association, the NSA, which is responsible for, you know, looking at cyber threats and other terrorist threats outside America, is actually spying on everyone in America. They're collecting data on all your texts, emails, messages, and phone calls. And those are being run through a computer, and then they're being censored to see, you know, is this a threat or not? And they're just gathering data on everyone in the United States. And the reason he said that is because NSA specifically under the law was not supposed to do that. In fact, Oregon Senator Ron Wyden, I think, was really leading the charge about making sure that didn't happen, spying on citizens. But it turned out the NSA has been spying on all the citizens of the United States, and that's what Edward Snowden was pointing out. He made this admission, and then the Justice Department said, why don't you come with us? And so instead he ran away because he thought he was going to be arrested. He went to Hong Kong and then to Russia, where he has been living in exile this entire time. He is wanted by the United States government. So our legal protections didn't seem to apply to him, and he's not been pardoned, and he's not been given, you know, assurances that he can return without going to jail. And the American people are sort of unsure what to think about that. No real determination has been made in the last 10 to 15 years. And so, where do Americans feel about freedom of information? You know? So, there really has not been a concerted drive of any majority in America to say Edward Snowden should be okay. And there's been some people, especially in the big government agencies, that have said Edward Snowden is not okay. We want to put him in jail. So where are we on this? You know, that's a good question. We'll see. So he's still living in Russia, and you will hear from him from time to time on the internet. You can look him up and see more about him if you want. If we go to another whistleblower, Julian Assange. This is a wild case. It is pages and pages of crazy drama. Just a few things. He is an Australian citizen that founded something called WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks, their goal is to provide information about what governments are doing around the world. So anytime he can get a hold of information that governments have secretly done something wrong, he gets that information and he publishes it. All right? So I think his first big break was something called the Panama Papers, where he showed lots of leaders of the world were embezzling money from their own countries. Okay, and I think Gordon Brown, Prime Minister of England, was one of them, and he got voted out, of course. The Prime Minister of Iceland was kicked out of the country for this, embezzling money from the citizens. So they were taking money and they were putting it in offshore accounts in Panama. And Julian Assange, through his organization WikiLeaks, pointed that out. Other leaders in Central and South America caused a lot of anger with their citizens against those leaders. Now, that also made a lot of enemies with leaders because they suddenly realized, oh, my dirty laundry can be exposed by Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And there was almost like a concerted effort to stop it. So governments of the world were not happy with this type of thing and this free flow of information. I think he then had another big information dump called the Podesta files. Podesta was the campaign strategist for the Democratic National Committee. And it turned out when he aired these emails, it really showed that the Democratic National Committee was not in favor of Bernie Sanders and were working actively to promote Hillary Clinton. Even though they were supposedly both on the same team and trying to choose the best candidate, there was clear bias in the emails, and that was very embarrassing. Okay? And so, you know, in America, he then made some enemies. And it goes into far more intrigue, and then it gets into things that I can't say for sure, but, you know, claims were made, people were shot, countries were accused, then they denied it. You'll have to read about it. It was a convoluted mess, okay? So eventually, Julian Assange got charged with attempted rape in Sweden, but he was in England, but the English tried to take him into custody, so he went to the Ecuadorian embassy. He lived there for several years. Remember, this is an Australian citizen accused of a crime in Sweden, trying to be arrested by the British, living in embassy in Ecuador. I mean, it's made for movies. So eventually the charges in Sweden were dropped. He was told he had to come out. He did. The British arrested him anyway, put him in prison, and he's awaiting some sort of charges, some sort of trial. Okay? So they've talked about extraditing him to America because he might have violated laws there. So he's kind of in prison and in limbo, and it's an interesting sign. All right? So something you want to consider there, we'll see what happens with Julian Assange, but he has made some very powerful people very angry at him. World leaders around the globe have really not liked the idea of free press. So if you're a person that wants a free flow of information, then Julian Assange is a person you ought to look into, because this brings us full circle to what is the press. Okay? What is the meaning of the press? Because when this was written in 1789, the press was someone, who found out some information and put it on a printing press, and they would run off some pamphlets and hand it out to people, and people would read it and say, really? Okay, and they would talk about things. So Julian Assange, or anyone who can put something on the internet, are they the press? All right? Because this is very interesting. Julian Assange won several awards from the United Nations for being a good journalist. So the United Nations recognizes him as part of the press. So how do we feel about this? What's the meaning of a free press? Is whatever people say the press? Do you have to be part of a corporation? Do you want your press to only be corporations like ABC, the American Broadcasting Corporation? So that's a question that we as Americans have to decide. Do we want an open source freedom press system, or do we want a closed source where there's sort of a select few that have the credentials of the press and everyone else is not the press? That's a decision we have yet to make. We're still wrestling with these ideas. What does it mean to be the press? Because if the internet is open source, then everyone's the press. The freedom of the press might as well just be freedom of speech. Okay? So if the internet remains an open source platform and is free, then everyone's the press. Everyone has freedom of speech, and you have the free flow of information. That's very threatening to groups like ABC, CNN, Fox News, NBC, CBS. These are corporate news agencies. And if they don't have a corner on being the press, if anyone's the press, then their jobs go away. In fact, their whole business disappears. So who dislikes Julian Assange more than anyone else is actually the network press agencies. Okay? So, interesting there. So we've got a lot of turmoil in freedom of the press these days. This is a really unique and involving area that we really have yet to decide on several categories of things. What does it actually mean to have freedom of the press? So hopefully this will give you a lot of information that you can look up on your own and research, and also ask some questions in class. I'll see you there.